Reprise du débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for Destinete, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm standing in the House today because First Nation, Métis, and Northern children are hurting. Their families and communities are struggling to make ends meet. They are denied culturally appropriate services. For example, when dealing with children and youth in care, their first languages of Cree, Dene, Michif, and other languages are not even considered and validated in trying to get support for the families. The realities of Northern Saskatchewan are rarely and barely recognized, Mr. Speaker. I represent almost half of the province of Saskatchewan, geographically speaking. For example, Northern residents have to travel long distance from home to their destination. In Sandy Bay, in my riding, the community has been struggling with a suicide epidemic for the last decade. Their families often travel between 6 and 8 hours to reach Saskatoon so that they can obtain the required help. Fond du Lac First Nation is a fly-in reserve in my riding. The cost of the airfare either to Prince Albert or Saskatoon is very expensive. The cost of living, the cost of buying healthy food, such as fruits and vegetables, is very expensive. Families simply cannot afford to support their children, youth, and elders. This year, the grocery store in Pelican Narrows First Nation burnt to the ground. Since then, the reserve and the nearby communities have no access to groceries because the Northwest Company has delayed their commitment to rebuild the store. In the meantime, in order to buy groceries, the vast majority of the residents must travel long distances. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, the children and youth are hungry on a daily basis. Since we've been speaking loudly about the challenges that Indigenous communities face in Northern Saskatchewan, my office has been receiving phone calls, emails, Facebook messages, and Instagram correspondences from youth and their families who are eager to share their painful, heartbreaking stories with me. For example, I've been in touch with families and neighbors who were painfully impacted by the most recent 4 suicides in Stanley Mission and Deschambault Lake First Nations. The youngest, 10, died last Tuesday while we await the final rulings on the causes of these terrible tragedies. We must ask ourselves, what do our children see? Do Indigenous children, girls in particular, see a country that in both word and deed champions their intrinsic importance? When they watch the news, check their Facebook and Twitter feeds, do our various levels of government and those in positions of authority convey the message that their lives are valued? Let's reflect on these questions as we consider the current state of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children across the country and the high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is why I want to speak in favor of the Opposition Day motion presented by my colleague, the member of Fort Timmins, James Bay. I would like to thank him for his long-time advocacy for First Nations and Métis children. Across Canada, and specifically in my riding, First Nations, Métis, and Northern residents were very hopeful with the language that the Liberal Party was using. Elders were pleased to hear the words nation to nation. Children, youth, and their families placed high hopes in the words real change. A year later, those very elders and the families are frustrated and questioning the Liberal government's commitment to nation relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Northerners. Hope is fading away. The government fails to acknowledge the sense of urgency in requiring services that our First Nations, Métis, and Northern communities face. When I was the mayor of Northern Village of La Loche, I worked collaboratively with government agencies and the local schools on this very topic. Teenagers from 14 to 18 years of age who were and still are in care, either going from home to home or they are literally homeless. When I was the chair of New North Association, the mayors and councils of 34 municipalities would share similar stories. The majority of these children and youth have treaty cards, so they are considered First Nations. They live in municipalities. What that means, they have virtually very little or no support. This brings me to the topic of the shortage of foster homes in my writing. When a child is apprehended, he or she is either placed in a home that is overcrowded or taken out of their community where a foster home is found. For example, when I visited Hatchet Lake First Nation a few months ago, it was shared with me that there was a home that sheltered 21 individuals, including small children. What's more, the Foster Families Support Group in Northern Saskatchewan has been continuously asking for support to train and work with foster families until this day. Mr. Speaker, the court ruling of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was clear on January 25, 2016. The Canadian government was found guilty of racially discriminating against tens of thousands of First Nations children in systematically underfunding federal services. The tribunal's ruling called on the Liberal government for immediate, medium, and long-term reforms so that children can receive the treatment they deserve. Because they are innocent children who deserve to feel safe, to be cared for, to feel valued, they deserve to have the same opportunities as everyone else. In not appealing the decision, the Liberal government accepted all the legal obligations placed on it. However, 2 compliance orders have been put out by the court because the government failed to meet the legal and moral obligations to First Nations children. In fact, instead of meeting the obligations ordered by the court, this government continued to fight First Nations children in court. I ask again, where is the commitment to a nation-to-nation relationship that this government promised to uphold when there's clear lack of urgency to act on this court ruling? Speaking of broken promises, Mr. Speaker, failing to comply with the court ruling is a direct disregard to the first TRC calls to action on child welfare. This first call to action demands that the federal, provincial, and territorial governments reduce the numbers of Indigenous children in care in Canada. Article 2 that stipulates that governments provide adequate resources to enable communities and child welfare organizations to keep Aboriginal families together where it is safe to do so and to keep children in culturally appropriate environments, regardless of where they reside. Now the tribunal decision found that the federal government was discriminating against 163,000 First Nations children in its delivery and child welfare services on reserves. The cumulative outcome of this intentional and discriminatory practice has led to children being removed from families to foster homes and frequently languishing in non-Indigenous child welfare systems. One example is the case Miss Mary Ann Napope from One Arrow First Nation, who has been fighting for several years to get custody of her grandchildren. There is nothing more that she would like than to reunite with them and to take care of them, but the foster system has failed her and her family. Her grandchildren were put up for adoption without the consent of the mother. They fell in the cracks of the child foster system. She says that she is committed to continue to fight to be reunited with her grandchildren. This is one story among many others, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in Saskatchewan alone, 87% of children in foster care are Indigenous. This is a number that is very concerning and can be reduced if this government adopted once and for all the Jordan Principle as ordered by the tribunal. At its heart, the principle states that First Nations children should be able to access the same government services as non-Indigenous children, and we must not allow jurisdictional disputes get in the way of providing services to children. Mr. Speaker, I would like to conclude by saying that I will be supporting my colleague's motion on Tuesday, and I invite this House to unanimously vote for the motion. A vote for this motion is a vote for First Nations children. Is it a vote for their safety? Is a vote for their recognition? Parliament must step in order the government to fix the historic wrong, because we cannot fail another generation of First Nations children. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy River.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. We know that First Nation communities in this country and Indigenous people indeed are suffering some of the worst tragedies right across the country. In her government's platform, they indicated that they were going to try to balance the budget. And they talk about that the Liberals aren't spending money on First Nations, and I respectfully disagree with that. But if my honourable colleague could answer the question on how the NDP would be investing in First Nation education at the same time as balancing the budget.
Honourable member for Desnathay, Mississippi, Churchill River.
It is very heartbreaking and very sad that our sitting government, who support First Nations children and Métis and Northerners across Canada, is supposed to support, find ways not to support the tribunal ruling and not ways to support the services and programs that are so very needed, not only on reserves across Canada, Métis municipalities, and straight across Canada. Regardless, the Liberal government formed government last year. They have the responsibility, when the Prime Minister of Canada speaks about nation to nation, children, youth, families, and elders, look to him and look for real change. And that's what the children in my riding, the youth and the families, look for.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Peace River, Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal government in their first 100 days spent $4.3 billion with a B, dollars outside of Canada, but they couldn't find the $155 million to fund the ruling that we're talking about today. I was just wondering if my colleague there could talk a little bit about that fact, and also the fact that there just seem to be inconsistencies across the board over there. For example, with the Transparency Act, and they're just refusing to enforce it. It seems like a complete undermining of the law. So, thank you.
Honourable member for Desnathay, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Again, it is very sad to have this discussion when I go into my riding or when I get a phone call. It's from a mom or a dad who's failed to get services for their kid who's just tried to commit suicide. And for all the tragedies that we face. Again, here we are. Canada was built in 1867. We're having the same argument where First Nations, Métis, and Northerners are not having the same equality as the rest of Canada. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton, Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her very heartfelt and grounded comments. We really value her expertise and her experience in this area. Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to ask my colleague this question. I've just found out that the National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations has endorsed the call by the Human Rights Tribunal to mediate the dispute over their call for action by the government. And they would like to have a mediation to actually resolve what is specifically required to be transferred, and establish a protocol and immediate needs-based funding to eliminate the discrimination found by the tribunal. It sounds like a very sensible approach, and I'm wondering if the member agrees that maybe the government could step up to the plate. Instead of consulting, why don't they actually sit down at the mediation table?
The honourable member for Desnathay, Mississippi, Churchill River.
When the Prime Minister visited my community of La Loche during the horrific tragedies, the Prime Minister stood before us in the community and said, whatever we need, they will provide for us. And then when I heard about the recent suicides and what the Prime Minister and the government had also said. But the realities are as such that they place barriers in place, discrimination, and not acting on the real solutions that the First Nations and the Métis communities and municipalities and Northerners are asking for.
Resuming debate.